Okay. So the endocrine system is a little bit very detailed. It's pretty detailed. There's a lot of different hormones to keep track of and a lot of different anatomical organization to keep track of. So I'll try to start like big picture, and then we'll drill down into like the details. And if you have a question at any point, just ask a question because it is a little bit complicated. So ultimately, let's start big picture, right? Like, what is the endocrine system? What's the point of the endocrine system? So the endocrine system is basically a signaling system that works with the nervous system that is in charge of a lot of different things: metabolism, reproduction, growth, everything. The endocrine system can react and alter those things. So what does that mean? When functioning correctly, the endocrine system maintains homeostasis. This is the key of the endocrine system. Everything that the endocrine system does is to try to return an out of balance state back to normal conditions. So a very common one is insulin, right? Everybody knows, well, everybody has at least heard of insulin, right? And we know that diabetics need insulin. Why do they need insulin? Well, when you have high blood sugar, right? When you have high blood sugar in a correctly functioning endocrine system, insulin will be released as a response to the high blood sugar. So notice the difference, right? It is in response. It is not proactively released to create low blood sugar conditions. It is reactively released in response to high blood sugar. So that's what we call negative feedback, right? How does that work? If there is some stimulus, right? The stimulus in this case is the sugar level is high. So the body will provide negative feedback to that stimulus. The endocrine system sees, oh, blood sugar is high. I will push back on that negatively and reduce my blood sugar. How will I reduce my blood sugar? By releasing insulin. So this is just broad strokes, big picture, what we call negative feedback. Something exists and the response reduces that something, right? The opposite would be positive feedback, where something exists and the response is to try to increase it even further. So these are the two different options, right? Either you could say, oh, I like this, let's increase it, or oh, I don't like this, let's decrease it and go back. So both of these things, positive feedback is a little rarer. We'll see one situation where it is important, but this is overall the mechanism of how of what a hormone is trying to accomplish, right? So how do we do this? How do we actually get those how do we get these hormones around our body to have an effect and do things, right? Okay. So the endocrine system releases hormone into the general circulation, meaning into the blood, right? And that's actually what endocrine means itself. So let me see. So there's different types of cell signaling. Endocrine signaling is referring to hormones that are transported across the bloodstream, right? And if they're in the blood, then they can go anywhere in the body, right? So that's what we want, right? We'll see where the hormones are coming from, but from where the hormones are coming from, they can go disperse throughout the body and affect the target cells way far away from where the hormones were actually produced. So this is endocrine signaling. Now, you can compare this to the other types of signaling, which are more on the cellular scale, right? This is involving a bloodstream, involving a blood vessel, whereas the other types of signaling are more localized to the cell level. So we have, if you just have one cell and the cell is releasing molecules that act on itself, this is called autocrine signaling, right? Auto, like self. Then you have juxtacrine signaling, which you may have heard of the word juxtaposition, which is two things that are directly next to each other. So this is when two cells are directly next to each other and able to, one-to-one contact with each other. And then you have paracrine signaling, which is they're not directly next to each other, but they're nearby. So this target, to make this a little bit more clear, It doesn't just have to be 1-to-1 like it is here. There could be another cell here, or another cell here, or another cell here. And in the paracrine signaling, all these things would get affected by this release of transmitter or signaling molecules. So that's the difference between the juxtacrine and the paracrine signaling. So this is all just to show you, these are not endocrine. This is just to understand what we're actually talking about when we're looking at endocrine signaling, right? So yeah, endocrine system releases hormones into the body's general circulation, most often through blood, to affect other cells or tissues at a distance, right? The big keyword here is at a distance. The other modes of signaling are not distantly affecting tissues. So I want to actually explain the anatomy first. I think that's more interesting. Let's see. Okay, so these hormones and stuff, right, are being produced by certain glands called the endocrine glands, right? And these glands, so you'll notice this is interesting, right? All these glands are spread throughout the body. So there's different sources, there's different organs that produce different hormones. And that's what we're going to look at here. So up here in the brain, we have the pituitary gland. Then over here, we have the thymus and, well, no, we have the thyroid and the parathyroid glands. There's these little dots on top of the thyroid. Then going down further, we have adrenal glands. You see adrenal, so on top of the renal, on top of the kidneys, the adrenal glands. Then we have the pancreas. Then we have, down here, we have the either the ovaries or the testes, the gonads, right? So just to kind of position yourself, these are the different organs that we're going to be talking about, the glands that we're going to be talking about, right? So this will help us understand what's going on here. So there's a couple of different types. Yeah, okay, let's talk about the types of hormones. Actually, before we talk about the types of hormones, let's talk about the, I think it makes more sense to, no, okay, let's talk about the types of hormones just briefly. So there's three, remember we talked about a lot about lipids versus proteins versus things that are hydrophobic, things that are hydrophilic, right? So the same thing is true for hormones. Actually, not all hormones are made the same. So there's three major categories of hormones. There's something called a peptide hormone. If you remember what a peptide is, peptides are the building block, are amino acids, right? Linked together by peptide bonds, right? Do you remember what the peptide bond is? It's the bond between the between amino acids, right? This is a peptide bond, right? When amino acids are binding together, you get a little peptide bond between the C and the N here. So so peptide hormones are amino acid chains, essentially, right? Peptides are essentially short proteins. So these hormones are essentially very small proteins. And since they're proteins, right, what do we know about their properties? They're polar and they're water soluble. They're hydrophilic, right? Proteins, hydrophilic, right? Remember? Because of the structure, we have this O negative charge here. We've got positively charged nitrogens, right? This is happy to be in water in a polar environment, right? So if it's able to move freely in the water, that means it can move freely through the bloodstream, right? So peptide hormones, right? The structure informs the function. This is a protein. Since it's a protein, it can move freely through the bloodstream. However, if it can move freely through the bloodstream, what happens when it gets to the cell? What happens when it gets to the cell? Remember, we talked about extensively about the idea of the cell membrane, right? And this cell membrane out here, right, is not polar, right? It's non-polar, right? Outside, it might be an aqueous environment, right? And the protein is happy to be in the aqueous environment. So I'll just draw a little peptide hormone, right? It's happy to be here, but once it gets here, right? Since this is a non-polar environment in the membrane barrier, how is the protein going to get in? Well, the answer is that it actually won't get in. It won't get in. Instead, what it will do is it will attach to a friendly membrane receptor. So this is how it gets around the problem of, not being able to go inside, because it doesn't have to go inside. What it can do is simply come and attach to this receptor here. And once it attaches to the receptor is going to receive the signal. It's going to say, okay, the hormone is here. I know what I have to do. And it's going to start processes inside of the cell. So this is how a peptide hormone works. It's very important to understand that a peptide hormone cannot get into a cell. It's just going to be outside and it's going to attach to the surface. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about how this system actually works, right? And that I think we talked about a little bit before. We talked about something called a G protein coupled receptor, or GPCR. Okay, big name. What does it mean? First of all, it's a receptor, right? Receptor on the surface of the cell. G protein coupled. All this means is it is a receptor that is coupled or combined with something called a G protein. So let me just explain what this is in the picture here. So let's just look, first things first, let's just look at this first picture just to understand. Forget about the rest of the picture right now. Just look at the first picture. In this scenario, right? We have this is the G protein, right? And more accurately, like this is the G protein and this is the receptor. I think they're just referring to it overall, but this is more like the receptor. I'm just going to put it as receptor. The receptor is up here so what happens is here we have a peptide hormone, right? Coming in and attaching to the receptor. And because this receptor is coupled to the G protein, that binding affects the G protein. So what happens? What happens is the alpha subunit, you'll see that it has alpha, and then this is a beta, and this is a gamma. So the alpha subunit separates from the beta and the gamma subunit. When that happens, it is causing effects downstream, meaning it is causing effects inside of the cell. So let me see. Did they show? Oh, this picture. Wait, let me see if there's a better picture. Ah, yes. Okay, this is what I'm talking about. So for example, we can see here. So we have the plasma membrane, right? The barrier. So this is a peptide hormone that's come here and attached to the receptor, right? Here's the receptor. And the receptor is coupled to this G protein, right? So once this thing binds, this is going to cause the following thing to happen. The alpha subunit is normally bound to a GDP. But once this binding happens, a GTP will attach instead, and that's going to separate it. And as long as the GTP is attached to the alpha, as long as the GTP, right here, the GTP is attached to the alpha, then we're going to have these signaling effects downstream. So what kind of signaling effects are we talking about? We're talking about, for example, adenylyl cyclase. So the GTP has come in and attached here, and the GDP left, right? While that's happening, all of this is happening. So this is a little complicated, but simply to understand, and this cascade changes depending on the receptor, right? Because different receptors will lead to different responses, right? So it wouldn't always be universal. It'll be similar. It might have similar things happening, but sometimes it's a little bit different in terms of exactly what's being phosphorylated, exactly what enzymes are being activated, right? But the point is, by doing this, you get a huge response. And one other thing to understand is that this picture is just showing you one of this event, right? But this can happen a lot. It can happen with multiple of this enzyme. So why is that important? Because only one molecule of epinephrine was able to signal the whole cell. Well, not exactly, but the point is that the effect increases exponentially because only one molecule needs to attach here for this whole cycle to get started and repeat, right? It won't just finish it once. It won't just do this once and then be done. It'll keep doing it until the epinephrine leaves. So this is very powerful. This signaling system is very strong because we can really get a lot of signaling power out of just one hormone. And that's how hormones can really effectively alter and respond very quickly to whatever the situation is in our body. So does that make sense? Any questions about this G protein situation? This G protein situation, it's not that every peptide hormone is going to go through a G protein, but this is a very common motif that they will definitely ask you about. So this is, they're even saying here, secondary messengers serve to greatly amplify the effect of the hormone, as the binding of a single hormone molecule on the surface of the cell can result in a much higher concentration of secondary messengers to be activated. And secondary messengers means the cascade stuff that we saw, everything happening downstream inside the cell. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So this is just the mechanism of those peptide hormones. Now, there's a variety of peptide hormones, and you do need to know, what do you need to know about these hormones? Number one, you need to know what they are, their names, right? What they stand for, what are they? Number two, what gland produces them? Number three, what is their effect, right? So you need to know that for every single hormone. It seems intimidating at first, but if you understand it in terms of a system, right, it becomes easier to understand. For example, glucagon and insulin are just both two different options for regulating blood sugar, right? So if you think of it as a system, it's easier to understand. So we're gonna deep dive into each of these hormones in a second. Let's talk about the other two types of hormones. We just talked about peptide hormones, right? Peptide hormones are small protein type hormones. Now we have steroid hormones. So steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol, right? If they're cholesterol and if they're lipids, right, then they're non-polar and not soluble in water. So then what? I said like they have to transport through the blood, right, for endocrine system. So how does that work? Well, in the bloodstream, steroid hormones need to be shuttled with a protein transport molecule. So they can't just be freely floating around in the water because they don't like that environment. They're nonpolar. So they need to hide inside of a special protein that provides them a nonpolar environment. There's a so now obviously, right, if we bring up the example that we had before with the cell membrane, right? If this is now a steroid hormone, right? Do you think that this hormone will attach to a cell receptor or will it go inside of the cell? because the barrier, the membrane is nonpolar and the hormone is nonpolar. So do you think it would like to stay outside or would it go into the cell? Into the cell, right? So this is a very direct contrast to our peptide hormones. Our peptide hormones are polar and stay out of the cell. Our steroid hormones are nonpolar, so they can directly diffuse through the cell membrane. They have no problem going through this nonpolar membrane because they themselves are nonpolar. So they do not require the presence of a receptor system, right? A big contrast. They directly pass through the membrane and they can bind to receptors inside of the cytosol, be transported to the nucleus, and even affect transcription by binding to DNA. So that's really important, right? Like that's super important because we always are concerned about transcription, translation, gene expression, right? So steroid hormones have an influence on that, right? So what kind of steroid hormones do we see? We see cortisol and aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. We see the gonadotropic hormones, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about how they work. Lastly, we have this kind of an offshoot of tyrosine derivatives. If you remember, if you've been studying your amino acids, tyrosine is amino acid, right? But these guys, remember, tyrosine is a big, like a nonpolar, chunky amino acid, right? Let me just pull up tyrosine. Yeah, you can see the big nonpolar chunky ring here, right? So the tyrosine derivatives are lipid soluble, and they also require that protein transport for the blood, right? Overall, they're nonpolar because of that chunky ring. So they are very small hormones in comparison to peptide and steroid hormones because they are just a single amino acid. They're just a tyrosine derivative. So a derivative is basically a modification, a small modification of I want to see the structure. Here. So a small modification of the original, right? So where's tyrosine? I want to see a comparison of tyrosine to T3 and T4 versus tyrosine. So, okay, so here's a good picture. So here we start with tyrosine, right? And then it's two. It's actually two tyrosines. So two tyrosines, and it's got iodine on it. So remember, you've probably heard of iodine deficiency before, right? This is where iodine comes into play. This is just a cool little fun fact. So tyrosine, so it's actually two tyrosine molecules put together with some iodine. In this case, it's two tyrosine molecules with 3 iodines. So you'll notice that the two thyroid hormones are called T3 and T4. Why? Because it's got 3 iodines, T3, or 4 iodines, T4, right? So these are the thyroid hormones, and they're smaller compared to the others because they're just it's just 2 amino acids. Okay, so now let's talk about their function, right? This is now we're getting into the strong details. So before we dive into the actual like functions and what all these hormones do, let's see the picture again. Where's the picture? Where's the picture? This one. Types. Here it is. Okay. So let's see, what are we starting with? The pancreas. I would rather start here. Let's start here. So when we were looking at the peptide hormones, we saw a huge list of peptide hormones, right? Especially anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. Okay, so let's look at that. What is that? What does that mean? So here's a pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is a very, very small structure inside the brain. It's got two structures, anterior and posterior, front and back, right? And the hypothalamus, which is the master control gland, is regulating this. So just to understand what we're talking about, inside of the brain, we've got our hypothalamus here and our pituitary gland at the base. And this hypothalamus influences the pituitary gland to release certain hormones. So let's see. Yes. So the hypothalamus, right? The hypothalamus releases its own hormones that stimulate pituitary responses. And from the pituitary, we get these hormones. So let me explain what those hormones actually are and how they work. So So this is what we were just talking about with the peptide hormones and the steroid hormones. Whereas the peptide hormones go and attach to a receptor, whereas the steroid hormones can slip inside into the cell, right? Yeah, we'll get to this. I want to show, this is fine for now. Okay, so the hypothalamus is up here, and it's interacting with this pituitary, with these pituitary glands, right? The hypothalamus, so now in the pituitary, there's an anterior and a posterior. There's two separate sections. Why? Because they separately produce different hormones, but they're both producing peptide hormones. The hypothalamus sends these nerve cells directly into the posterior pituitary, and they synthesize oxytocin and something called ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone. It's also called vasopressin. So oxytocin and ADH come directly from the hypothalamus into the posterior pituitary, and then the posterior pituitary releases them. So sometimes you can get like a little bit of a tricky question asking where do oxytocin and ADH, where are they produced? And technically they're produced in the hypothalamus, right? So the hypothalamus interacts with the anterior pituitary through a portal system, which is called the hypophyseal portal system. So what is a portal system? A portal system is essentially, let me see here. Portal system. A portal system is, so look at the comparison here. In a normal flow of blood circulation, the blood passes through what's called a capillary bed. A capillary bed is where your transport happens. So for example, you can see that the blood goes from red to blue here. Why is that happening? Because the blood is dumping its oxygen out into the tissues surrounding, right? Capillary beds are very, very small blood vessels where even red blood cells only go through one at a time. Like the vessel itself is so small, like a very fine tube, and only one red blood cell is going through at a time. So when this is happening, they are dumping their oxygen directly into the surrounding tissue, right? So that's a capillary bed. Now in a portal system, we have two capillary beds. Why do we have two capillary beds? Because in the first one, hormones get put in, in the second one, hormones get put out, right? That makes sense. The hormones get put in, and then the hormones get put out once they travel down to where they need to go. So we actually have an example of that directly, even within this hypothalamic and pituitary system, right? And it's called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. What's happening? Well, the hypothalamus is putting the hormones into the capillary bed here, right? The blood travels down, gets to the pituitary, and then it releases the hormones into the pituitary. Now notice that this system is only happening for the anterior pituitary. Remember what I said for the posterior pituitary. For the posterior pituitary, there's actually nerve cells that are directly innervating the posterior pituitary and releasing that way. So it's not through the blood in the posterior pituitary. But in the anterior pituitary, it is through the blood, through this, what we call a portal system. So, and that since it's in the blood, it can now release it out into the circulation, into the blood, right? So, got that. Okay, so now let's actually talk about what are the specific what's actually being produced, right? We've talked about how it's being produced, but what is actually being produced. So we have the following hormones being produced from the anterior pituitary: FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone; LH, which is luteinizing hormone; ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone; TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone; prolactin, endorphins, and growth hormone. So the mnemonic that is very common for this is called flat peg, because FLATPEG, FLATPEG. Those are the hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary. So what do these guys actually do? FSH and LH are involved in with the reproductive system and the gonads, essentially. So FSH in women matures the follicles into mature eggs. Remember we talked about last time when we talked about reproduction, we had these hormones that we're going to talk about more in depth now. LH is a luteinizing hormone producing testosterone, right? LH can also stimulate progesterone production. So let's take a quick peek at the reproductive system. Had a good picture here. Yes. So remember we were talking about the reproductive system, and everybody understands like the role of hormones in pregnancy, right? So these hormones are doing things to the body to, support the pregnancy. So for example, you can see that estrogen, right, in dark is increasing and then decreasing, right? The mnemonic for that is estrogen. So this is referring to the endometrium. You can see the endometrium here in the uterus, the lining, right? This lining is thickening so that a egg can be supported there, right? So the mnemonic is that estrogen establishes the endometrium, all E's. Estrogen establishes the endometrium. It starts the thickening here. Then once it has been thickened, and if an egg attaches there, then progesterone will start to increase. Progesterone protects the endometrium and causes it to grow more. Then we have the LH spike. The LH spike is timed with ovulation. The LH spike is what's causing the ovulation. So you can see that the hormones have a big impact on what's happening in the whole situation. And yes, so each of these hormones are going to influence systems throughout the whole body. right? And right now we're just looking and understanding that, oh, the hormones can do everything. When you look at the system itself in depth, you'll understand more, oh, this hormone does this because the system needs to do this. That's kind of we're kind of looking at it from a top-down approach. So the next one is adrenocorticotropic hormone, right? Adrenocortico. As soon as you see cortico, you think of cortisol, you think of stress, right? Released in response to stress, either metabolic stress or stress from the environment. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex to release cortisol, a type of stress hormone. You may also see it referred to as a glucocorticoid. Yes. As a result, cortisol is produced by the body in response to stress. So I think we talked about it. So, thyroid stimulating hormone. Actually, before I go through, I'm going to talk about each of them in depth as they come up. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. So the adrenocorticotropic hormone, once it's released, so for I want to show the adrenal medulla, maybe in here. Okay, well, so the adrenal, okay, so this is the adrenal gland, right? The adrenal gland has two separate layers, essentially, the outside and the inside. So the adrenal medulla is in the middle, right? And the adrenal cortex is on the the outer layer. The adrenal medulla can produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, or as you may have heard of it, adrenaline and noradrenaline, right? So these guys are our stress hormones, right? So what this guy is doing, adrenocorticotropic hormone, is it's going to release it and then stimulate the cortex to release. Oh, sorry, I got confused. This one is for the cortisol. Okay. See, it does get okay. This adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. The cortex to release cortisol. So we'll come back to the adrenal medulla. But this one influences the lighter cells on the outside to release cortisol. And cortisol is a stress hormone, right? So then the other one, the epinephrine and the norepinephrine, right, are tyrosine derivatives. This is a little bit different, right? So this is why it's important to keep track of, where everything is and how everything is working. And so you could definitely get a question of like, which part of the adrenal gland is producing what? And the way that I like to remember it is adrenal medulla, EN, right? So that spells AMEN or amen, right? And then adrenal cortex, right, is just AACC. So adrenal cortex produces aldosterone and cortisol. That's just my fun memory trick. But just to keep it straight about which things are being produced where. So the adrenal glands are found on top of the kidneys, right? Adrenal. The cortex is the outer layer. The medulla is the internal layer. And the adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. They're tyrosine derivatives called catecholamines. And so that refers to these guys, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and so first let's talk about the cortisol that we were just talking about. These guys are steroid hormones called glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids increase blood glucose levels and the rate of protein fat metabolism. So why would we want to increase blood glucose levels in terms of a stress response, right? This cortisol is being released so that we have more sugar available to us for fight or flight reactions, right? For running, for breathing hard, for whatever, right? The stress hormone stimulates gluconeogenesis in the liver to increase blood glucose levels. So there's also, you probably heard of like, if you have chronic stress, right? How it damages your body. Cortisol has anti-inflammatory properties that reduce the immune system response. So this is good if we're in a fight or flight situation because inflammation could slow us down, right? It's taking up energy. But it's not good if you're stressed if you're unnecessarily stressed, right? If you're unnecessarily stressed, then your immune system is not being able to do the work that it needs to be able to do when you're relaxing, right? So cortisol, very important. And it's important to understand that all of these things have to have a balance, right? That's the whole point of the endocrine system. You don't want cortisol all the time, but you need cortisol when you need it in a stressful situation. Then we have aldosterone. I don't think we touched upon aldosterone yet. Okay, I'll come back to aldosterone. Then we have epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? Adrenaline and noradrenaline. Tyrosine derivatives that are synthesized in the adrenal medulla. This is a hormone. Epinephrine is a hormone, while norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter. Both are released in response to stress. When faced with stress, the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine. This stimulates vasoconstriction of the gastrointestinal tract and kidneys, along with the vasodilation of lungs, brain, heart, and skeletal muscle. So remember last time we were talking about the nervous system, right? And we talked about the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic system was the fight or flight, right? And we said that we have these responses of dilating our pupils, rapid heartbeat, right? Breathing harder, right? But the question was, what was causing all of that, right? What's actually causing all of these effects of, accelerated heartbeat, inhibition of digestion, right? Well, now we know it's the endocrine system. It's the endocrine system which reacts to, us seeing a tiger or something running to us, right? And in response, it will release this epinephrine. And this epinephrine is going to do everything. It's going to shut down our digestion, right? It's going to say, okay, let's stop digesting. Let's put that energy into vasodilation of our brains or our lungs so that we can breathe fast and we can get moving, right? So that's a big response. Aldosterone is also produced by the adrenal cortex. This is a mineralocorticoid. And essentially, mineralocorticoids are, so just like cortisol is a glucocorticoid that is regulating the amount of glucose, right? The mineralocorticoid is regulating the amount of electrolytes. So electrolytes are any like charged molecules in our blood. So charged molecules being sodium, potassium, even protons, right? All these things. So that's what aldosterone does. What aldosterone does is, we'll understand this more when we look at the kidney. The aldosterone helps us to reabsorb more sodium, more salt, right? And secrete potassium and hydrogen ions out. So we'll talk, because we're doing this, it's increasing our water reabsorption. Because the water is attracted to, the water will go, if we think about osmosis, right? Just in general, if we just think about osmosis, right? If we have a bunch of ions in here, right? If we have a lot of ions in here, then the water is going to want to go in there. And that's essentially what aldosterone is doing. By hanging on to all these ions, it's forcing the water to go to where the ions are. But we'll explain that more when we talk about the kidneys themselves. Okay. So I think just a few more hormones that we're talking about for the anterior pituitary gland. So we talked about adrenocorticotropic hormone, right? Now we have thyroid stimulating hormone. So thyroid stimulating hormone is going to work on the thyroid. Where is it? Right here. So this is, okay, we're jumping ahead. Let me just show you in general. So we talked about the thyroid here, right? This little thing that's on top of our, was our larynx? Something like, I forget what this is called. Larynx, pharynx, trachea, one of those. This is on here, right? And this guy helps us produce, it stimulates the thyroid to release T3 and T4. And T3 and T4 work together to set the metabolic rate of the body. They control our metabolism. Then we have prolactin, which stimulates the production of the milk. Very important dynamic here. Prolactin produces. Oxytocin leads to the release of the milk. So this is just two separate things. Prolactin will help produce the milk in the mammary glands, but the oxytocin is what actually allows for the milk to be released from the mammary glands. Yes, so this right here is an example of positive feedback. When a baby suckles, right, it stimulates the hypothalamus, which stimulates the pituitary to release prolactin. So this is a situation where something is causing a response to occur, right? Promoting a behavior rather than reducing a behavior. So this is a positive feedback example. Then we have endorphins, right, which are released in response to pain or physical stress, also related to exercise. And then last one is human growth hormone, which stimulates growth and development. Increase in cell size, muscle size, protein synthesis, all that good stuff. Growth hormone. There's an important distinction between human growth hormone and human chorionic growth hormone, which is produced by an early embryo during pregnancy. HCGC. I don't remember if we talked about this or not, but human growth hormone, we have growth hormone coming from our anterior pituitary. Now we're done with the anterior pituitary. Now we have the posterior pituitary, secreting two things, oxytocin and ADH. So we just said that oxytocin leads to the release of the milk after produced in the mammary glands, and it also increases the frequency of uterine contractions during childbirth. Another example of positive feedback. When there's a contraction and when the baby is trying to come out, that is leading to that has a positive feedback loop where more oxytocin is produced and more contractions occur. So contractions start slow, but then ramp up, right? That's because of the action of oxytocin. The oxytocin is produced more and more based on how many contractions are occurring. Then we have antidiuretic hormone, which is, again, another kidney-related thing, is just absorbing water, and which allows, increases blood pressure, right? We're going to talk about those guys more when we get to the kidney. Okay, so we just talked about a lot of different hormones, right? And now we need to understand how is this all organized? How is this all organized in the body, right? It's organized through something called a hormonal axis. A hormonal axis. So let's start first with, essentially an axis is kind of, it's basically just the organization of it, right? So first we have the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So what does this involve? The hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands, right? So how does it work? So the hypothalamus will tell the pituitary, so let's say there's some stress, right? Remember, this is all in reaction, right? This is all reactive and all in response to what's going on. So there is some stress occurring, right? Maybe a tiger is running at you. There's some stress occurring. Now the body is going to respond in this way. First, number one, the hypothalamus is going to release CRH, which is cortisol releasing hormone, I think. No, corticotropin releasing hormone. Yes, corticotropin releasing hormone. Oh, let me bring this up a little bit. Yes. So corticotropin releasing hormone is a peptide hormone that stimulates ACTH production. So, okay, let's not get it confused, right? All this time I was talking about adrenocorticotropic hormone, right? So what is CRH? Well, the thing to understand is the hypothalamus releases its own hormones that act specifically on the anterior pituitary. Remember, we talked about that idea of a portal system, right? That's why there's a portal system. Because the hypothalamus is releasing its hormones, right? Those hormones are going there. Those hormones are then depositing in the anterior pituitary and then causing the anterior pituitary to release its own hormones. So there's actually two different hormones happening there. That's why there's a distinction. The hypothalamus is not producing those anterior pituitary hormones. It's only producing the hormones that make the anterior pituitary produce the hormones. That sounds confusing, but that's what's happening, right? So essentially, if the hypothalamus, let's say there's some stress response, right? Now the hypothalamus is like, okay, we're stressed. I'm going to produce CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. CRH travels down here. And then when it comes to the anterior pituitary says, wow, I just got CRH in here. That means I need to release ACTH. And then the body, the adrenal glands, are going to receive this ACTH. Does that make sense? This is very critical to understand. That the hypothalamus is not producing those hormones, it's producing the hormones that tell the anterior pituitary to produce the peptide hormones. Make sense? Okay, good. So let's go back to our axis and understand what we're looking at. So the hypothalamus, right, just made this corticotropin releasing hormone. It went and it acted on the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary says, oh, okay, so I have to now make adrenocorticotropic hormone. The adrenocorticotropic hormone goes and acts on the adrenal glands. Specifically, it acts on the cortex, right? Yes, because I'm just going to use my mnemonic. Adrenal cortex produces aldosterone and cortisol. Okay, so yes, we're good. So it acts on the adrenal gland cortex, right? Okay, and now that cortisol is going to give us all the stress response effects that you would expect. So this is how an axis works. This is essentially what an axis is doing. It's a pathway for this effect to happen. And so now here's another really important thing. This is a whole thing is a feedback system, right? It's all a feedback system. In this scenario, the stress is causing this stuff to happen, right? The stress, you can see the arrows, right? The arrows are pointing, meaning it's activating this, right? Stress is activating this, is activating this, is activating this, is activating this. However, once we get to cortisol, right? Here's an interesting problem, right? When do we stop? When do we stop making cortisol, right? How would the body know, hey, we're done, let's stop making cortisol? Well, the cortisol itself has negative feedback. It performs negative feedback on the very glands that produced it. So this is essentially the cortisol telling the glands, hey, you produced enough of me already, you can stop. You can stop making more. You don't need to make more cortisol. And if this isn't malfunctioning, then you get chronic stress because your body can't understand that it needs to stop producing cortisol, right? So cortisol built in, the very presence of cortisol is actually, the presence of cortisol inhibits CRH secretion by the hypothalamus, right? So this is pretty useful. The other thing is, for example, we have our stress response, right? So let's say our stress was that we were feeling very tired, right? Let's say we were really tired. And then the cortisol caused our kidney to do gluconeogenesis, and then we got a little bit of blood sugar going and we feel better, right? Once that happens, once the stress response makes us feel better, our stress decreases, right? Because our stress decreases, we stop producing more cortisol. So understand that this is a feedback. This is what we mean by an axis. It's a loop. It's a loop of bringing us back to the right stable environment or stable homeostasis. So yeah, so this is the stress, this is the cortisol. So this is all called the hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal, right? We have the hypothalamic, the pituitary, and the adrenal. This is the HPA axis in charge of stress. Any questions about the HPA axis? I think it makes sense.
So
Go ahead.
sorry, so stress overrides anything that cortisol stops, right? For example, if the person still has stress, no matter how much cortisol they have, it's still going to, the mechanism is still going to go forward.
Yes, good question, right? Yes, the mechanism, so the cortisol can inhibit these guys like in a healthy system, right? But if you have so much stress, right? If you're in a really stressful situation, this is going to keep pumping. I know that this would never, like, there would never be that, like, you can get exhausted, right? From having to, from your stress response going on for too long, that at some point you need to just like fall over and go to sleep, right? But I'm not sure if that's because of the cortisol itself, or that's just because you got exhausted. That's a good question. But I understand your question. You're saying that the cortisol wouldn't just stop this if the stress was still happening, right?
Right, that's my question.
Right. I don't know. I believe the answer to your question is that the stress would keep this going until the stress response has reduced. And if the stressor cannot be addressed, that's when you get chronic stress and chronic cortisol release.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Thanks for the question. Actually, I think we're going to talk more about stress with in the in which section? Is this psychology? I think it's in psychology. I think we talk more about stress in psychology, which is pretty interesting. Okay, so now we move on to the hypothalamic pituitary, same thing, but then the gonads, right? Okay, so how does this one work? So the HPG axis plays an important role in the reproductive system, starts at the hypothalamus, secretes gonadotropin releasing hormone. So notice that we're releasing something different this time, right? Before, corticotropin releasing hormone, now gonadotropin releasing hormone, right? And this guy causes the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH, right? So then the FSH and the LH will have different effects on the gonads, on testosterone, in men, right, it will act on the testes and produce excess testosterone. In women, acts on the ovaries and produces estrogen and progesterone. Again, we have that negative feedback loop because we don't want to have too much testosterone or too much estrogen or too much progesterone, right? Same thing, once you understand like how an axis works in general, like it's the same idea. Oh, the last one, yeah, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is we can. Should we cover this now? This is only going to make sense if we talk about digestion first, though, because it's pretty. Let me see if it would make sense or not. Oh, no, they didn't even put the. No, let me see if I can find. Let me see if I can explain it or not. With aldosterone, yeah. Let me see. Mm, Renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, blood volume, blood pressure. I think we can talk about it. I just need to explain a little bit about how the kidneys work, but not in depth, because that's a whole different section. Yeah. Okay. Let me see how I'm gonna talk about this. Oh, there's also different zones of the adrenal gland that you can. I don't remember if they ever tested me on this. I really don't remember if this is even. Hmm. There are different zones that produce like because we of the even of the cortex, right? The cortex is made of 3 different zones, and each of them are producing different like. Remember, we said the cortex produces aldosterone and cortisol, right? But these 2 different zones produce 2 different things. I don't remember if this is. I don't remember if this is in scope or not. Oh, the pancreas. We didn't talk about the pancreas. Okay, let me talk about the pancreas and then we'll talk about the the aldosterone. So again, another axis, right? Oh no, we talked about this one. This is the thyroid stimulating hormone. So we have the TRH acting on the pituitary again, acting on the thyroid, acting on T4 and T3 to be released, and that's going to affect the cells and increase their basal metabolic rate. The pancreas, right? The pancreas, I need a picture of the pancreas to show you the different cells. The pancreas has different alpha, beta, and is it gamma? I think it's gamma cells. Let me see. Pancreas cells. Oh, it's delta. Wait, is it beta? No. I want to see alpha, beta. Aha. So the alpha cells secrete glucagon, the beta cells secrete insulin, the delta cell secretes somatostatin, but we'll get to that later. The main things are the glucagon and the insulin. So these guys are in charge of the blood sugar. If the blood sugar is high, right, we secrete insulin to put the sugar away into the cells, right? That's how you can remember it. If you need the blood, if there's too much sugar in the blood, you need to put it away in the cells. So you release insulin. If there's no sugar in the blood and you need a little bit more blood sugar, then you use glucagon. Why? Because the glucose is gone from the blood. So we need to put more sugar into the blood. So those are the two hormones that control that. So now let me see how I can talk about osmolarity and stuff. Renin-angiotensin. Okay, let me see. Oh boy, this is more detailed than I want to go. This isn't bad, actually. Oh, this isn't bad. Okay, yeah. Okay, we can do this. Okay. So essentially, we talked about this antidiuretic hormone, talked about aldosterone, right? And we talked about what are these things, right? What are they doing? Essentially, they can help us control blood pressure. How do they do that? They work with the kidneys to do that. So this is the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, right? This is an axis that works. It looks a little complicated, but this is how it works. Let's just follow along. First, let's say that there is a situation where the blood pressure has decreased, right? When the blood pressure decreases, it causes renin to work on all this stuff we can talk about a little bit more later. Essentially, the liver and the lungs are going to give rise to enzymes, to proteins rather, that are going to affect the production of aldosterone by the adrenal gland. And when the aldosterone increases, what is the effect of aldosterone? The effect of aldosterone is that it increases the sodium reabsorption in the kidneys, right? By increasing the sodium reabsorption, we increase water retention. Remember, we talked about osmosis. When there's increased, if we're taking more sodium up, the water is going to follow the sodium, right? So when the water follows the sodium, then we have more blood volume, and that's going to increase our blood pressure. Not only that, but the angiotensin that was produced through this renin system also will constrict the blood vessels. So not only do we have more blood volume, but we also have more blood pressure. So let me see. Aldosterone, okay, aldosterone is similar. It's similar, but a little different. It will also increase blood pressure, and it will, because it's increasing water retention. Oh, no, hold on, sorry. I meant ADH. ADH is it. Wait, am I getting confused? ADH is the water. Okay, I'm not sure which one I said before. There are two things that do very similar things with one major difference, okay? Both of them are increasing blood pressure by increasing water reabsorption, okay? That's the main thing. The question is, how do they do? Antidiuretic hormone does it just by taking the water in. Aldosterone does it by taking sodium in, which causes water to come in as well. So the main difference is the antidiuretic hormone is not absorbing sodium. The aldosterone is absorbing sodium. Okay, main difference. The other thing is antidiuretic hormone. You may have heard of a diuretic, right? A diuretic is something that patients can take to increase their urine output, right? If it's antidiuretic, then you would decrease your urine output. Why would you decrease your urine output? Because you are reabsorbing more water and you're peeing out less water. So that's what this system is. We're going to explain it more when we come to the liver in general, and the kidneys rather. But these two have this kind of system where they are different ways of increasing the blood pressure. This is in response to a decreased blood pressure, essentially. So the ADH is made in the hypothalamus and released by the posterior pituitary, along with oxytocin, right? ADH comes from here, whereas aldosterone is coming from the adrenal glands, right? So two different separate things. And the other thing to talk about is the osmolarity. So the ADH, so osmolarity is how much ions that you have in your blood, right? So you're supposed to have a certain amount of osmolarity in your blood, right? So what happens if you drink way too much water, right? If you drink way too much water, then you have kind of flooded your system with too much water, and there's not enough osmolarity. The osmolarity decreases, right? So what do I mean? Let me just draw it out to explain what I'm talking about. Let's say you have a bucket, right? And you have this much water, and you have maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 molecules of whatever, right? So then if we say, if this is 1 liter of water and this is 5 ions, then right now we have 5 ions, right? Per 1 liter of water, right? Now, what if I dump a bunch more water in? That's essentially like, what if you drank a gallon of water, right? And you just drank, we dumped in another 1 liter of water, right? Now we have 5 ions per 2 liters, right? So what happened? The amount of ions per liter decreased, right? Before we had 5 ions for 1 liter. Now we have 2.5 ions for 1 liter, right? That's a decrease in osmolarity. That's the term, osmolarity. When there's a decrease in osmolarity, what the ADH does is it tells the kidneys to keep more sodium and to not pee the sodium out, to rather keep the sodium. So if we keep the sodium, then we will have, when by keeping the sodium, we can return to our original osmolarity level. So what keeping the sodium will do is essentially add more ions to our circulation and even out our osmolarity. So effectively that's what the goal of ADH is. Now, if we compare that to aldosterone, aldosterone is doing what we did here, dumping water at increasing our water retention, but not caring about the osmolarity. So the osmolarity may decrease because it's not taking up any sodium. Okay. So let me just make sure that I covered the, yeah, if you have any questions at this point, you can put in chat or unmute. Let me just make sure that we covered what we wanted to cover. This. Oh, okay. Yeah. So again, just another example of the feedback, right? Of the feedback loop. So this is thyrotropin releasing hormone, right? The hypothalamus releases the thyrotropin releasing hormone, causes the anterior pituitary gland to release the thyroid stimulating hormone. The thyroid gland then gives negative feedback to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary saying, okay, I got your message, I got the TSH, I'm going to do that. You don't need to give me any more TSH. And it's going to release its T3 and T4, and then we get some effect, right? And this was what I was talking about with the positive feedback with the oxytocin. When the baby is heading towards the cervix and it's causing stretching, the stretching is going to lead to the release of oxytocin. And this is a positive feedback loop. It's not limiting it as it happens. It's just causing it to happen more and more and more, right? It's just continuously looping. And so that's going to lead to the eventual childbirth because the contractions keep increasing. Okay. So I think we've covered everything that we need to cover with the endocrine system. I think we are ready for the passage. Any questions before we hit this practice passage?
So for the MCAT, do you recommend knowing exactly what each hormone, like different mechanisms, how different hormones can affect other hormones? What do you recommend doing for the MCAT?
You need to know the I think they said it here. Yeah. Where did they say? I thought I read it somewhere, but maybe not. You need to know all of these hormones. You need to know where they're coming from, right? That's especially important, and where and what they're affecting. So for example, if I ask you like what is TSH? What is TSH? tell me everything that you can tell me about TSH. The things that you can tell me about TSH are, number one, where it's produced, or even initially, like, how is it produced, right? So how is it produced? Well, the hypothalamus will secrete the thyrotropin releasing hormone and cause the production of TSH in the anterior pituitary. Once the TSH has been produced, it will through the blood, it will go through to the thyroid glands, right? On the thyroid gland, it will stimulate those cells to produce T3 and T4. T3 and T4 promote cell metabolism. So overall, what I'm asking for is, number one, the stimulus that gives rise to that hormone, right? So for example, in the stress situation, it could be that basically understanding the axis. Actually, rather than write this out, really all I'm asking is that you understand how the axis works. If you understand this axis, right, that's essentially all that you need to know. Understanding what is giving rise to the situation, understanding the names of the hormones involved, understanding that this is the effect of the actual hormone itself. Does that make sense, or is there anything missing?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Welbeck, the ADH works with sodium like the aldosterone, or am I confusing the two? So only one of them works with the sodium. Let me see. And this is kind of hard to explain because obviously it would make more sense if you have the whole idea of the kidneys first, but we'll get to that, I think, next week, because next week is digestive. So okay, here. Okay, perfect. We have a perfect picture here. Okay. So ignore all the anatomy. Like, forget about the anatomy right now. Just understand the concept. Aldosterone, right, promotes sodium reabsorption. So what it's doing is it's saying the aldosterone is going to influence the situation to grab these sodiums, right? It's going to say, okay, actually, I need to keep the sodium. Maybe the osmolarity is low and it wants the sodium to increase the osmolarity, right? So it grabs sodium. It's stealing. So basically, to understand what's going on here, anything that goes down is going to be urinated out. Anything that's taken out into the tissues is going to be retained by the body. Okay, so anything going down is going to be urinated out. So before the sodium gets urinated out, the aldosterone is going to encourage that it gets removed and kept by the body. When the sodium is being put outside into the tissue here, the water in the urine, right? The water that's going to be leaving in the urine now wants to follow the sodium because of the polar, actually, it's not even about polarity, it's about osmosis, right? If we have a bunch of sodium here, right, inside of our cell, then the water will want to go this way. And it's the same concept here, just the shape is different. If there's a bunch of sodium out here, the water wants to come out, right? But if there's a bunch of sodium inside, right, if it's a ton of sodium inside, then the water will go the other way. The water would be going inside to where the sodium is. All the water will be going to meet the sodium inside. So okay. Let me just focus on aldosterone right now, and then I'll compare it to ADH. Aldosterone is promoting the sodium reabsorption by taking the sodium out of the urine before it leaves the urine. That causes the water to also leave. that causes the urine to become more concentrated and darker, right? Because there's less water in it. So now let's compare this to ADH. Now, we can see a nice difference here. In aldosterone, we were taking the sodium out, which causes the water to come out as well. In ADH, we are just taking water out, and the sodium we don't act on. We're just taking water out. So at the end of the day, we're taking water out and we're keeping it in our bodies, right? So we are going to increase our blood pressure, right? But the question is, are we doing it by keeping sodium or are we doing it without sodium? And that's simply aldosterone keeps the sodium, ADH does not keep the sodium. Does that make sense? That's the key difference. Okay, awesome. Very good. So, and we're gonna revisit this when we talk about the kidneys. It's good. There's a lot to talk about with the kidneys. So very good, very good, very good. Now I think we are ready for a passage. Okay, so let me see, what time is it? 11:30. Do you guys want to try the passage first, or you want to go through it? If you want to try the passage, I can give you. How about we take maybe 15 minutes-ish to do a passage? Yeah, it's 11:30 now. That seems good. Let's you can scroll down here and read this passage, and we'll come back at 11:45 or 11:50, and then we'll go over a passage together. Any other questions before we start this passage? Okay, so we'll meet back at 11:45, I think. Okay, so pituitary gland. The pituitary gland works closely with the hypothalamus to regulate homeostasis, metabolism, reproduction, and growth in multiple target organs. The pituitary gland is separated into the adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis, known as the anterior and posterior lobes, respectively. So this is another thing you might see: adeno and neuro. This is just anterior and posterior, right? And remember, it's neurohypophysis because it's the hypothalamic neurons that are producing the oxytocin and the ADH directly, not the posterior hypophysis, not the posterior pituitary itself. Pituitary, 5 types of somatotropes, HGH, lactotropes, PRL.
Hassan, your mic is cutting off at certain points.
It's cutting up? Okay, let me see.
Yeah.
Thanks for telling me. 1 second. How about now? Let me just try, and if it stops again, just let me know. Hello? Uh-oh.
Yeah, I can hear you.
It's working? Okay. Okay. So somatotropes, lactotropes, thyrotropes, corticotropes, and gonadotropes. Okay. Pituitary organogenesis and hormone synthesis is a complex process that is not completely understood. Many different transcription factors are temporally and spatially regulated. PIT1, for example, is required for pituitary cell differentiation, and the PIT1 gene has been implicated in GH, TSH, and prolactin deficiency. In a recent study, scientists have discovered a transcription factor, the ZBTB20, that could play a key role in anterior pituitary development and lactotrope specification in mice. ZBT is a zinc finger protein that contains these domains and C2H2 cripple type zinc fingers. So all of this stuff is like, it's just there to throw you off. It's real, but the thing is, you don't need to understand what they're talking about to understand the trends in the data and the questions, right? To further characterize the role of ZBT in anterior pituitary development, scientists performed a knockout experiment in mice. ZBT global knockout mice were bred and their phenotypes characterized. Hypopituitarism was found to be a result of the ZBT knockout. Further results are presented in figure 1. Okay, so ultimately, all this is they have a transcription factor, ZBT. They thought, oh, maybe this is related to anterior pituitary development, so let's do an experiment. We're going to knock it out in some mice, and what is the result? Hypopituitarism was found to be a result of the knockout. So their theory was correct, right? Their hypothesis was correct. This ZBT does have a key role in anterior pituitary development. How do we know that? Because when we knocked it out, we saw that there's hypopituitarism. So hypo meaning less pituitary activity as a result of the knockout, right? And so now we can look at these graphs. We see that the body weight, remember I talked about these little stars, what these stars mean? If it's a little star, it's 0.05. P is less than 0.05. If it's 2 stars, P is less than 0.01. So this is just the confidence interval, right? Basically, 1 star means that it's significant, 2 stars means it's very significant, 3 stars would mean it's incredibly significant results, right? Ultimately, this is just saying that these results it's very unlikely that these results were the cause of randomness. Most likely it's because of the knockout that we did. Again, we see those stars here for these various graphs, just comparing the levels of those hormones. So let's look at these questions. Number 1, suppose a patient presents unregulated oversecretion of thyrotropes from the anterior pituitary. Which of the following symptoms is this patient most likely to experience? Unregulated oversecretion of thyrotropes from the anterior pituitary. I know most of these things, but I don't know what a thyrotrope is. Luckily, this passage introduced this concept of a thyrotrope being TSH. Okay. So they're basically saying, what happens to the patient if they have too much TSH running, right? Okay. So what is TSH? What do we know about TSH? Well, TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. And what will that do? Well, it might not be thyroid, it might be thyrotropin or something like that. Forget exactly, but it's that, right? Stimulating hormone. So what is the thyroid's hormones? What does the thyroid produce? The thyroid produces T3 and T4. And what do those hormones do? Well, those hormones increase cell metabolism, right? So of these different options, if we do increased metabolism, right, which of these is most likely to occur? Metabolism, right, is our breakdown and our digestion of various nutrients and foods and stuff, right? It seems that the one that would be most likely is weight loss, because if we have increased metabolism, then we're not packaging sugars and fats away, but rather we are breaking them down if T3 and T4 is increased. So if we have increased cell metabolism, then we have increased breakdown of fats and sugars. And if we have increased breakdown of fats and sugars, then we have decreased fat sugar storage, and then we would have decreased weight. So that's my logic for this. The other options here don't necessarily have anything to do with metabolism. Vasodilation of heart and lungs is more like sympathetic fight or flight, right? It's not necessarily cell metabolism. So I think A would be right here. Oops. Question 2. Abnormal levels of which hormone most likely explain the results shown in figure 1? So if you look at figure 1, we see that the body weight has decreased a lot in the mice that were knocked out. Oh, let me just explain this part of the graph in case you haven't seen it. When you have this plus plus and this minus minus is referring to the alleles. So in the plus plus, it's a mice that has both ZBT. It has the ZBT. It has one ZBT allele and it has two ZBT alleles, right? So ZBT is intact, and they're saying that the dotted line, the line with the dots, is the normal mouse, the mouse that has both ZBT alleles. However, this mouse, which has a negative negative, was the knockout mouse because it's lacking both of those genes. So since it's lacking those genes, it's the triangle. It's the triangle dot. So that's what that notation means. The plus slash plus and the minus slash minus. You can even get plus slash minus, where only one of the copies of the gene is knocked out. This is also something that you can see. So what was I doing? Abnormal levels of which hormone most likely explain the result shown in figure 1. So, okay, so the result is that over time, the body weight decreased for who? Did it decrease for the normal or for the knockouts?
Knockout.
For the knockouts, right? These guys are the knockouts with the triangle dots. So, and it's a significant decrease, right? Notice the gap between these confidence intervals, right? So this is a significant decrease between these two sets of test subjects. So that significant decrease, now they're basically saying, so now we have, so the first part that we have is we saw that knockouts had a significant decrease in weight, okay? So ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, cortisol, you could, it wouldn't be, they're saying abnormal levels, but did they specify, is it increase or decrease of the levels? Let me take a look. Oh, they do have, oh, okay, so they do have here what we're looking at. So growth hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone is about the same. LH is about the same. So even though this one looks smaller than this one, you have to pay attention to if they have the significance asterisk. There is no significance asterisk here. So you cannot say that these are significantly different. You would not be able to say that by knocking out that ZBT, we saw a significant decrease in adrenocorticotropic hormone. We didn't, because these guys are still within the error margins of error. So it could be that it's just a random change and not significantly because of the ZBT. Whereas for here, for prolactin, we can say this is a significant change that we see directly as a result of the ZBT knockout. We also see a significant result for the growth hormone. We don't see a significant result for the TSH. So it's not TSH, it's not ACTH, and it's not LH. It could be either growth hormone or prolactin, right? So if you look down, Would it be growth hormone or would it be prolactin? So now the question is, which one has the more likely has relation to weight, right? Would prolactin be in charge of weight or would growth hormone be in charge of body weight? What do you think?
Growth hormone, maybe.
Growth hormone, right? Yeah, exactly. So growth hormone is the one that would if since, and this makes sense, right? Why does this make sense? We see that the knockout has a significantly less amount of growth hormone. If the knockout has a significantly less amount of growth hormone, this explains why the body weight for the knockouts is significantly less, right? So this makes sense. This is a logical answer. Okay. Any questions about that one? Did not consider the second figure, so I chose C. Okay. Okay. So the reason I looked at the second figure was because they said abnormal levels of which hormone, but that didn't tell me if it was high or low levels. So I was like, like, because the reason I was thinking that was because, like, if you have so much stress, maybe you could lose weight, right? Like if you're not digesting properly because of your stress or whatever. So I was like, do they, that made me think, like, do they have more cortisol or do they have less cortisol? Let me go see. And then that actually showed me that there's no difference in the cortisol, but it showed me that the TSH also had no difference, right? And so the reason, so I think this was a little tricky because question 1 tells you that, you would have weight loss if you had oversecretion of TSH, right? But question 1 is a hypothetical question. Suppose a patient, right? In actuality, in this experiment, they did not have a high amount of TSH. There was not a significant difference in the TSH. So this was a little bit of a sneaky, I think. It's easy to put those two things together and think that the first one is talking about the experiment, but the first one is not actually talking about the experiment. So yeah, a little tricky for sure. Even they say figure 1, right? But figure 1 was not enough information to understand these things. So if it says something like figure 1, right, that's your starting point. It doesn't mean that you're limited to the figure 1 information, right? This question could just as easily have been written as, this question could have been rewritten as abnormal levels of which hormone explain the decrease in body weight in knockout mice, right? If you wrote it like that way, then it's the same question, right? But then you're not limited to figure 1. Then you would probably have to look at figure 2 and then you would figure out the answer. So don't limit yourself based on the figure that they mentioned. Just use it as a starting point. All right, very good. Very good. So now we've got question 3. Which of the following hormones are secreted by the neurohypophysis? Again, another new terminology that they gave us, right? They said neurohypophysis is posterior lobe, right? So this is a very, very simple discrete question. What hormone is secreted by neurohypophysis, aka the posterior pituitary? Do you remember, of these 4, which of these is secreted by the posterior pituitary? We covered a lot of hormones, so no worries if you don't remember. But this is the kind of question that you would be asked, right? Like a straight up discrete question. So we've got epinephrine and oxytocin. So when you see a question like this, the good thing is not only to figure out the right answer, but to also figure out the other answers, right? Because this question could just as easily be which of the following hormones are not secreted by the neurohypophysis or secreted by the anterior pituitary or whatever, right? So epinephrine, right? Epinephrine is a peptide hormone, right? And it acts on, wait, is it? No. Sorry, it's not. It's a what's it called? Thyroxine derivative. It's yes. Wait, hold on. Sorry, am I getting confused? Epinephrine is a what? Epinephrine. Not thyroxine, tyrosine derivative. Sorry, yes, tyrosine derivative. Epinephrine. Okay, so sorry about that. So epinephrine, right, comes from the adrenal medulla, right? Yes, epinephrine, norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla. That adrenal medulla is stimulated by the anterior pituitary by the ACTH hormone, right? And that ACTH hormone is being released from the anterior pituitary. Why? If we go back and look at our axis, right? The ACTH hormone, oh, sorry, no, anterior. Wait, sorry, I think I misspoke. The adrenal medulla, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Since face with sympathetic nervous system stimulates epinephrine and norepinephrine. Yeah. Yes. Oh, okay, yeah. Okay. Sorry. So the epinephrine and the norepinephrine, right, are coming from the adrenal medulla. These guys are being released. Where are they being released from, though? They're not being. Actually, let me just check. I don't remember. Epinephrine. Is it just through? So my question right now, I'm trying to figure out how the epinephrine is actually signaled to be released. The question is it through hormones? Or is it just on its own? I think it's just through the sympathetic nervous system. Yeah, I think that's the thing. So that's why it's a little confusing, and you need to know like what's causing things to be released, right? So since this is just the sympathetic nervous system innervating the medulla and forcing it to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, the pituitary is not actually involved with this, with epinephrine and norepinephrine system, right? Whereas aldosterone and cortisol are through the pituitary, through the ACTH. So, okay, so let's go back, right? So our epinephrine is coming from our sympathetic nervous system. Our oxytocin is indeed coming from our posterior pituitary. And that we saw with the from the posterior pituitary. Oh, this is a nice picture. So here we can see the difference. The hypothalamus is up here. In the hypothalamus itself, the neurons of the hypothalamus will produce ADH and oxytocin, and they will directly put them down to the posterior pituitary, where they are released for the bloodstream. For the kidneys, the ADH can go to the kidneys, and the oxytocin can go to the mammary glands and the uterus. So that's direct. And then we have the anterior pituitary, where we are producing in the hypothalamus not the direct hormones, we're producing the hormones that will influence the anterior pituitary to produce the direct hormones, such as TSH, such as ACTH, and whatnot, right? So In this case, it is just ADH and oxytocin that are produced directly by the posterior pituitary. Then we have progesterone and aldosterone, right? So where does progesterone come from? Well, progesterone is coming from it's one of those that comes from the FSH and LH, right? So those are the gonadotropic hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary, right? And then aldosterone is not here, but from the adrenal cortex, along with, so aldosterone progesterone from the anterior pituitary, and the aldosterone, whoops, produced in the hypothalamus, released from the posterior. Oh no, this is antidiuretic hormone, not aldosterone. Yes, aldosterone is through this system, the renin-angiotensin system. So this is a whole nother system, right? Where the controlled by the blood pressure, controlled by the renin system for the adrenal cortex to produce aldosterone. So this is why it's a little bit tricky through renin system. This is why it's a little bit tricky, not just knowing the identity of the hormone and what it does, but also what causes it, right? Where does it come from? That's also a little bit tricky. So it becomes easier once you know the systems well. Once you understand like how the systems work, then you can understand like, oh yeah, blood pressure would be related to this because the lungs have a component and the kidneys have a component, so it's got to be through that way. Right now, it probably seems out of nowhere, like, oh, aldosterone from the kidneys, like why? But once we cover that, you'll start understanding the whole broad scheme of things. So it's obviously the easiest thing to do is just to memorize that oxytocin and ADH are from the posterior pituitary. But yeah, so it should be this. Okay. Now, which of the following conclusions can be drawn from figure 2? So let's look at figure 2. Well, let me understand, what are they thinking? ZBT knockout leads to decreased production in all hormones, no effect, severe defect of lactotropes, necessary for anterior pituitary organogenesis. Well, I know it's not no effect because there was some effect. Decreased production in all hormones from the anterior pituitary. Is that correct or incorrect? What do you guys think? ZBT knockout leads to a decreased production in all hormones from the anterior pituitary. Does this picture show a decreased production in all hormones from the anterior pituitary? Incorrect, right? Because some of these look like decreases, but they're not significant decreases. So that's wrong. Severe defect of lactotropes. Well, what's a lactotrope? I have to go back and see. A lactotrope is prolactin, right? What do we see here? We see a severe decrease in prolactin, right? Double star, very significant decrease. That seems to be correct then. Severe defect of lactotropes, necessary for anterior pituitary organogenesis. I don't really know what they're talking. Oh, I see. They're saying like for the development of it, for the development of the pituitary, necessary for anterior pituitary organogenesis. I think that's a step too far, because it's true that, so here's the thing, right? That's kind of like an extreme answer. This is saying ZBT is necessary for to make the organ of the anterior pituitary in the first place. But all they said was that after they did the knockout, they saw hypopituitarism. They didn't say an absence of the pituitary. They said that the pituitary was underdeveloped. It was smaller, hypo, right? So, and we see that some of these not all of the hormones drop to zero, right? They would be zero if there was no pituitary, but there is a pituitary, it's just smaller. It's still producing some of the hormones. So we can't say that it's necessary, right? Because if it was necessary, then we would have no pituitary, anterior pituitary. But it doesn't seem to be necessary, it just seems to be important for normal function. Okay. So that makes C seem like the best choice. So I think we said weight loss, we said growth hormone, we said oxytocin, ADB, ADBC, ADBC. So let's look at our answer choices here. An excessive secretion of thyrotropes leads to an excess amount of TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, stimulates the thyroid to release T3 and T4. Unregulated high TSH levels leads to high T3 and T4, leading to a high basal metabolic rate. So that's how we got to the weight loss, right? The second one, based on the figure, the body weight of the knockout mice is significantly lower. Of the hormones presented, only low levels of growth hormone can contribute to this results. B, Neur's hypothesis refers to posterior pituitary, only secretes ADH and oxytocin. Epinephrine is secreted by the medulla. Progesterone is secreted by the gonads. Aldosterone is secreted by the adrenal cortex. We went one step further and we tried to find out, like, when do those things happen, right? When is epinephrine secreted by the adrenal medulla? When we're under fight or flight, when the sympathetic nervous system asks for it, right? So knowing when, not just where, but when, right? When is a very important, is actually, this is just a tangent. When is very, very important for biology, because there's a lot of different functions that we have, right? In metabolism, in endocrine, in nervous system, in whatever, right? There's a lot of different functions that we have, but not all of them are running at the same time. So if you can group them into all of these things happen when we are in this situation versus all of these things happen when we are in this opposite situation, if you can group it that way, it will become much easier to remember, because you won't be stuck remembering like 20 different separate things. Instead, you'll just be remembering two sets of things that are similar. So that's really helpful to group it in terms of when. What is the situation that would lead to this kind of response by the body? Yeah. So yeah, statistically significant decrease in growth hormone, all other hormones level appear to be similar. Lack of asterisk shows they are not different in a statistically significant way. Yeah. Okay. So, any questions? Okay, then I think we can stop there.